So we're talking about manifesting, exploring what it means, not everybody may be familiar with this concept, so I will explain just very briefly what we mean when we use the term manifesting. The idea behind that term is that there is a correspondence between your state of consciousness and the thoughts in your mind and your circumstances, external circumstances. And also that you can influence or change your external circumstances by changing your thoughts, your thinking. Now, some people believe that that's complete nonsense. Sometimes when you read in the mainstream media about things like that, they say this is just absolute nonsense. You just by thinking about something, you're not going to create it. That, of course, is a misunderstanding. It's not as simple as that. It doesn't mean that just by thinking about something you then create it. But there is undoubtedly an important truth hiding there, and that is that there is a relationship between your predominant state of consciousness, your predominant thinking, type of thinking, and what you experience as your reality. First of all, what you experience as your reality already goes through the filter of your mind. You have sensory perceptions, which is the prime substance of your so-called reality, and then you have the filter of your mind that interprets and labels your reality. And of course the filter of your mind, what kind of a filter you have, depends on the way in which your mind has been conditioned to evaluate things, to label things, to judge them, and so you incorporate the primary level of reality, sensory perceptions, whatever happens to you or what you do, and that is then interpreted through your conditioned mind. Your mind is conditioned to interpret these events in certain ways, and not only interpret, the interpretation of your mind also determines how you respond or react to things that happen around you. So in that sense already you can see that there is clearly a relationship between what you call your reality, or some people call it your life, and the content of your mind. So how you experience your life is not so much determined by what happens to you, but much more so by the way in which you react or respond to what happens. And your reaction then has further repercussions, because your reaction creates further events in the external. And that is why people get trapped in their own kind of world or reality without realizing their contribution towards it. So perhaps you have known people, or you know people, that experience similar situations, often unpleasant situations, again and again, no matter where they go. Sometimes it applies to relationships. You have one relationship, it comes to an end in a negative, bad way, then they encounter somebody else. Similar thing tends to happen again and again, and sometimes the outside observer can see clearly that there must be a pattern there, because this person seems to recreate the same partner, some cases an abusive partner, and again the same pattern repeats itself. And often the person to whom this happens, they may not be able to see it because they cannot differentiate between what happens to them externally and their contribution to what happens to them externally. So that means they are manifesting their reality unconsciously. They don't know it. So, and that is something perhaps you also experienced that in the past, and most probably you have already awakened from that state of unconsciousness. But of course, yes, it's much more difficult to discover it in yourself, to realize that this is what you are doing, than to see it in somebody else doing it. So manifesting, one could say everybody does it. I believe nobody could argue with the fact that there is a connection between external circumstances and one's inner state of consciousness, conditioning of your mind, mental, emotional conditioning. So it's not just the way in which you, just to repeat, it's not just the way in which you interpret events, it's the way, the condition of your mind, the conditioning of your mind determines also what you say and what you do as a reaction to those events. So undoubtedly that's the case. So everybody manifests, and most humans manifest the way in which they experience their life. And then comes the realization, maybe if I change the way in which I react to things, and if I change the way in which I interpret things, then perhaps not only will I experience my life in a different way, but perhaps I can even bring about changes in my so-called life. And the deep idea underlying this conscious manifestation, consciously choosing certain thoughts, letting go of other thoughts that perhaps have been dominant in your mind for many years, underlying that is the idea that your thoughts are connected to the underlying consciousness beyond the surface of things. Your thoughts are connected to the invisible dimension of reality and that which governs the creation of form, and by changing your thoughts you can change the forms in which the life appears to you. The idea that this is possible came to me when I was 17 years old through some books. We were living in Spain at the time, and a German woman, a friend of ours, came and she said, "I'm going back to Germany and I want to leave a few things with you. I'll pick them up again when I return." And she left a few of her possessions, and among her possessions were 5 or 6 old books. And I picked up these books. They were written by a German writer who used the pseudonym or his spiritual name Bo Yin Ra. And I started reading these books, which were written in a biblical style, like a biblical prophet speaking, very strange, old-fashioned style. And these books spoke of aligning yourself with the spiritual dimension of life, and they spoke of the possibility of changing your way of thinking and thereby changing the way in which you experience reality and changing your entire life. And this was so revolutionary. I couldn't believe what I was reading, and yet I realized deep down that this is actually true. And I also became aware that I had been trapped in negative thinking for many years already. I was only 17 years old, but I realized how much of my thinking was of a negative kind. So that was my first. It was by no means an enlightenment experience, but it was a first disidentification from thinking and recognizing my own thinking rather than being totally trapped in my own thinking. So I just want to show you, I have a couple of these books that she left. Miraculously, these books survived my many moves from country to country and place to place. And so these are just 2 of them. Bo Yin Ra. This one is called Das Buch der Liebe, the Book of Love. This one is called Das Buch der Königlichen Kunst, the Book of the Royal Art. Most of them are published. They're published in Switzerland and in the 20s and 30s. So I read these books, and I found a while ago, looking through some old boxes, miraculously something survived from that time that I actually copied from these books. And let's see, I wrote this when I was 17, and I copied what I thought were the most important ideas in these books. And I'll just read a few sentences to you, then you'll see how why they were so important to me. I have to translate into English as I read the original German. Every thought is a building block in your developing destiny, a building block towards the good or towards evil. According to the nature of your daydreams, you are accumulating either gold or explosive material in your destiny. Every thought picture, if imagined with sufficient intensity, could be materialized immediately. In every human being, this power is there in potential. To surrender to a helpless mood of anxiety or irritation means you're opening yourself up to the thought streams of every negative and irritated human being in your whole city, and therefore charging the magnet of your mind with harmful and destructive energy streams, and so on. And I was realizing, as I read this, that in a way I had been doing that to a large extent. I had certain thoughts in my mind about myself that were very negative. One of the thoughts was, whenever something happened to me that wasn't good, challenging, the thought came into my mind, of course, bad things always happen to you. I was always talking to myself as you, as many people do that. Of course, bad things always happen to you. And often they did. So I started to become aware of my thinking and changing it. And not only my thinking, but also my moods, the emotions that go with the thoughts. And there was later on, I realized that the term one could use is I was raising my frequency, vibrational frequency. And suddenly, I was 17, I was longing to get away from my dad and his wife, who were in a dysfunctional marriage. And a few months later, I was offered my first vacation job in England, and that was in itself miraculous, how that came about. Then I had to come back after 3 months, and I continued to practice becoming aware of my thinking, letting go as much as possible of negative thinking. And then the next thing that happened was I was offered a job in England without an interview, with virtually no qualifications, actually no qualifications, not even no high school graduation or anything. I was offered an actually good job in London in a very miraculous way, and I realized that was the result of having changed my thinking. Now, so that was a very important thing for me. It did not mean, however, that I was free of ego. It did not mean that the new situation that I went into did not, after a while, also become problematic and present its own challenges, and it did not free me from becoming depressed in my early, mid, and late 20s. So I fell back into negative thinking and so on. But I had a glimpse of what is possible. And so the teaching that then developed is, as you probably know, I primarily teach being. Doing is secondary. These two dimensions are the primary dimensions in your life, doing and being. Most humans are lost in doing. They are completely identified with their doing. They are but when I use the word doing, I include thinking in it. When you think, you do. Most humans only know the dimension of doing, so they live in a state of stress, anxiety, and completely unaware of the dimension of being. My primary teaching, as you may have noticed, is to bring you to the awareness of being. And that is also the primary teaching in the teaching of Jesus. Jesus taught primarily how to be consciously, and he used the term the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God, which, by the way, as you might know already, I translate as, I've changed the translation, kingdom of heaven in my contemporary translation is the dimension of spaciousness. Heaven is the sky, the spaciousness of the sky. He used that term in order to point to something that is within you. So he used a word from the outer sense perception reality to point to a reality that is within you. And the closest word that he could find in the sense-perceived realm as an analogy for something that is within you is the sky or the heavens. Because when you look up into the heavens, the sky, in many languages it's the same word, then what is it that you see? You see a vast spaciousness. There are clouds here and there, and beyond the clouds there's vast spaciousness. There isn't actually anything there. That is, the sky or heavens is not an object. Or we have a word for it, but the fact that we have a word for it does not mean that the sky actually is something that has an actual existence. What do I mean by that? I mean, you can never arrive there. You can go up in a balloon or in a rocket, and you can never say, oh, I'm now in the sky. Where is it? You can never touch it, because it's just an appearance. The sky is just spaciousness. You can go into a cloud, but not into the sky. The sky, you never reach it. If you go up in a rocket, you're in outer space, and there's no more sky. Just absolute spaciousness. So what we perceive as sky during the daytime is something to do with the visual, what the sun does, seeing the light of the sun against the darkness of space creates that luminous sky. But the sky is not an object. And that's why Jesus very wisely used that term to talk of something that is within you in consciousness, which I call the formless consciousness, or pure consciousness, or pure awareness, as opposed to consciousness that has taken on a form that is thought. Every thought is a formation, a thought form, an energetic formation. Most humans are so identified with the energetic formations of their thinking, every thought that comes, that they are trapped in it. And this is, you're trapped in doing. So the doing begins with being trapped in every arising thought. And then, of course, externally, the external world makes demands upon you, and so you're constantly seeing what's the next thing that I need to do, and so you're constantly being pulled out of yourself, out of the deeper dimension of who you are, the essence of who you are. You're not even aware of it. You're always out here, and then what's the next thing that I need to think about? Even if you're in bed, you're still doing, because what's going to happen tomorrow? What if that happens or that? You're still doing, and you're never free. When you relate to people in your family, you relate to your children and your spouse, your partner. Always talk about something that needs to be done, and this, have you done that? And now, what do we do now? People can't listen to others because there's too much interference. There's never that spaciousness there. And so being lost in doing is the fate of millions and millions of humans on the planet. And Jesus was talking about that when he used this is a story. Whether it happened or not, we don't know. The story goes that Jesus was invited to lunch in the home of two sisters, and there were some other people there too. And these two sisters, the names of these two sisters were Martha and Mary. Now, Jesus was sitting there, when he was talking, Mary was sitting at the feet of Jesus, listening to him in state of rapt attention, and Martha was busy working in the kitchen, getting lunch ready, and she got very upset with her sister Mary because she wasn't helping, and she went to Jesus and said, Jesus, why don't you tell my sister that she should help in the kitchen, because we're not going to get the lunch ready on time. And Jesus surprisingly said, Martha, Martha, you are worried and anxious about many things, but only one thing is absolutely needed, and Mary has chosen that one thing, more or less. And that's very interesting. If you look at that, you could say, well, if everybody lived like that, if Martha lived like that, then who would be preparing the lunch? You would just be sitting there and nobody's doing anything anymore. But that's not what it means. Jesus was pointing to what is primary, and what he is saying is that primary is to be in a state of connectedness with being. Everything else, any doing, is secondary. And ultimately, Martha and Mary ultimately should be seen as one human being. You have to be both Martha and Mary to live a life that is fruitful and balanced and sane. So that is finding the balance in your life between being and doing. And manifestation can only be satisfying and truly effective when it arises out of the being state of consciousness, rather than the doing state of consciousness, which says, now I need to do the manifestation. And when you are trapped in doing, and identified with doing, you're also obviously identified with ego. Ego ultimately means complete identification with the mind, the thinking mind. And that's the basis of ego. and the emotions that accompany the thinking mind. And then you identified with all the things that arise from the thinking mind, all the things that you do and want to achieve, and so on. So, primary is being, and we need to go a little bit more deeply into that experientially, so that being is not a concept that we're trying to understand, but being is something that we experience or realize at first hand, here and now. For the experience of being, you need to become aware that that which underlies, or is, one could say, is behind all your thinking, is a state of still, alert presence. So, to realize being, you need to step out of thinking, if only for just a moment, like now. And when you step out of thinking, you cease to be a person for a moment. You're no longer a person because you don't remember your past or anything. You don't need to. In that moment when you step out of thinking, you don't know anything conceptually. And while I talk about it right now, of course I'm inviting you, if it's not happening already, I'm inviting you to experience or realize what it is that I'm talking about. It is unbelievably important. It is the most important thing in your life, to realize that dimension of consciousness within you. Is it possible for you at this moment to be in that state of alert, relaxed attention, just aware of whatever sense perceptions may be there, but not thinking at all? So there's this gap, there's a space, an inner space, where you are conscious and aware, but not thinking. And that space is, there's enormous power there. At first it seems like nothing. It seems like you've disappeared and you don't know anything anymore. And yet, if you look more deeply, you realize that you have a very strong sense of beingness. You know that you are. That sense of beingness or presence, when you acknowledge it, you realize that that is your, I sometimes call it essence identity, and more recently I've been calling it the deep I. When you say I, usually you refer to the historical person, which is your conditioned mind. But here, so that is that historical person. I say historical because it's derived from the past. The conditioning of your mind becomes who you are. That is the surface I. And then there is the deep I, is the I that is consciousness itself. I am. when thinking stops for a moment, you come to a very deep realization of I am. You know that you are, and you know that that is the essence of your identity. The essence of your identity is that sense of presence. And what is that? Of course, you can ask that question afterwards, but you don't need to ask that question in the moment of experiencing it, because that question is thought again. The mind may come in later and say, well, what was that sense of presence? Maybe I lost it, or maybe it's still there even when you start thinking again, which is how ideally it should be. This is to aim for, is that you can think without losing the sense of presence, the underlying I am. Martha and Mary, a single being. So then you are able to think and to take action without being completely lost in the thinking and in the actions, without going, there's always a dreadful way to be totally lost, reacting, and even if you come up with things, the new things, what do I have to do now? Let's come up with, okay, I need to create this, I need to build up. You could start trying to do manifestation on the basis of what the needs of the historical person are, what the needs of the ego are, and of course the ego has many needs. The ego is a sense of, one of the characteristics of the ego is a sense of insufficiency, a sense of not enough, a sense of lack. That is the mind-made self, which is looking always to enhance its identity, its sense of self. So it's because it's never enough, and it always feels threatened. You could lose something that you had identified with, so that's a threat. Or a threat is you might never get what you think you need for your ultimate fulfillment. That's a threat. That's in the future. I may never get there. And then there's the threat of other people who threaten your mind-made identity, because other people might have more than you, they might know more than you, they might be better looking than you, they may be more powerful than you. And to the egoic self, anybody who achieves something or has something nice is already perceived as a diminishment of their sense of self. So somebody has a nice, let's say your friend buys a lovely dress and your ego feels diminished. You can see how this is not uncommon. It's just one of many examples. Or somebody gets a promotion and you feel diminished. Or somebody you went to school with has already achieved more than you and is now driving a Ferrari and you are driving a VW, and then you meet again and you feel diminished in your sense of self, because you're deriving your identity from certain things that the egoic self wants to identify with, and it compares itself to others continuously. And if it feels superior, then for a while it feels bigger. That's great. I have more than you, I know more than you, I can do more than you. And yet there's always the fear that somebody else may come or I might lose it. So you're continuously dependent on what happens out there, what other people do or have. Almost always a sense of non-fulfillment, of lack, of insufficiency. That is part of the egoic state of consciousness. Now, if you might then read books on manifestation and say, oh, now I know what to do and how to achieve the things that I need in order to find that ultimate fulfillment, and then you follow what these books, because the books might say, if you only think certain thoughts, you can bring about those things. So then perhaps you begin to imagine, okay, what I want is to drive this car, the Ferrari, and see, okay, what I need to do is see myself in the Ferrari and make affirmations that of whatever it is I want. I affirm that I have my own company and I'm making a lot of money and I have this big house and this great car and a good-looking spouse that enhances my sense of self. And so some people then practice manifestation, but all the things that they are attempting to manifest are designed to free them from that underlying sense of insufficiency, not enough, not having arrived yet at this, not being fully yourself. And they may have some success in their manifestation, although if you're only coming from ego, your powers of manifestation won't be that great, but you may have some success. But the downfall is that none of these things are going to fulfill you. So they're not going to free you. In fact, everything that you achieve will create new problems for you because you're still living trapped in ego. And none of the things that you achieve will free you for long from that sense of insufficiency. And you will continue to look for yourself in other things and achievements and situations, but always reaching out, never arriving. So that is the fate if you are not in touch with the depths dimension within you, the deep I. So it's impossible to underestimate the importance of this. And that is absolutely primary. And any true spiritual teaching must apply, it would apply to a person who is just starting off their adult life, or to a person who is 95 years old and coming to the end of their lifespan. The superficial teachings of manifestation, those teachings that claim that the ultimate in spiritual living is to manifest what it is you want or need, those would become meaningless if presented to a person who has come close to the end of their lifespan. What is a 95-year-old person is unlikely to be very interested in manifesting this or that. As you approach the end of your lifespan, it becomes even more important to go deeper within yourself. You don't need to manifest anything anymore. You need to make sure that you are in touch with the essence of who you are and that the ego dissolves. So a true spiritual teaching must be valid no matter what your life situation is. So if you take the manifestation teachings and isolate them and say that that is the essence of spiritual living, it's not. You would find one frustration after another, even if you achieve what it is that you want or think you need. So the downfall then is to practice or attempt to practice manifestation techniques without having realized the essence of who you are. And now, of course, the question arises, but if you realize the essence of who you are, would you still want or need to practice manifestation? Would you still need to do it? Would you still want to do it? And we'll come to answer that in a little while. For the time being, however, right here and now, it's more important, before we look at manifesting from the possibility or the desirability of manifesting from your essence, before we look at that, let's make sure that we experience that deep I. We realize that deep I. Jesus said, more or less, the only thing that matters, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, the only thing that matters is the kingdom of heaven. Seek the kingdom of heaven, and when you find the kingdom of heaven that is within you, all the things that you think you need will be added unto you. That was his teaching, and this is a very profound statement. If you find the kingdom of heaven, and all the things that you need will be added unto you. That means all the things that for people who are not in touch with the depth dimension, all those things are primary for those people. But when you are in touch with the depth dimension, you may still, of course, you have needs for certain things in your life, and you may appreciate certain things in your life, but they are no longer primary. Nothing in the realm of things, nothing in the realm of achievements is primary anymore. But you can still appreciate things, but they're not primary. Possessions, how your body looks, even relationships. All these things, as the words I use are these things. There are many things in your life that are relatively important. There's no denying that whether you are rich or poor, you have no money at all or plenty of money, makes a difference. Of course, is a relatively important, or whether you are healthy or not healthy, is of importance. It makes a difference. But it's still relatively important. Even your relationships, whether you have a wonderful family or you live alone, makes a difference undoubtedly. But even that is relatively important. And so the terms that I use is there's only one thing that's absolutely important, and that is finding the essence of who you are and living from the essence of who you are. Then all the things that before were of primary importance, and when you lost them, you were devastated. Now, when you lose something in the realm of secondary importance, of relative importance, it still affects you, yes. Let's say your partner suddenly leaves you. let's say your business enterprise suddenly collapses. Of course, yes, it is perceived as it affects you to some extent, but it does not affect you in the very depths of your being. That is the difference. You are no longer absolutely devastated. It does not mean you have deadened yourself to feeling anything, not at all. You still feel. Somebody dies, you cry. A loved one dies, you weep. Tears come. And yet, you are not devastated. You don't condemn the entire universe because somebody has died prematurely. There is still the connectedness with the deep I, which we can also call the transcendent dimension of life. Loss of the transcendent dimension is or not even ever finding the transcendent dimension to life. That is the greatest deprivation there could be. Loss of the transcendent dimension, and that unfortunately is the fate of still the majority of humans on the planet, perhaps even more in the more developed countries than others. Loss of the transcendent dimension. You can see it when you observe people's behavior, how they are completely identified with the things that happen, the anxiety, the reactivity. You can see, and if you read occasionally about people whose reputation has lost their reputation, they've lost their money, they were very wealthy, and then they commit suicide because that's all they know, because their entire sense of self was bound up with their reputation and their money, who they were in the eyes of others. And when that collapses, either you're in terrible suffering, or you commit suicide, or the transcendent dimension suddenly opens up for you. That is the grace that's hiding behind every misfortune or disaster. There's always the possibility that, yes, it makes you deeply unhappy at first, but it is a potential opening into transcendence when something in the world of form has left you, so that the mind-made sense of self that consisted of identifying with this, and this, so you were a bundle of identifications, ultimately all thought, because ultimately you're not identified with the car, the house, your social position, or whatever it may be, because the car, the house, your social position, and so on, they are thoughts in your mind. And so, although we could say, yes, you are identified, you derive your sense of self from those things, but those things, ultimately, you experience them as thoughts in your mind. And these are thoughts that are invested with a sense of self. These are self-thoughts. That is the self that the Buddha talks about when he talks about delusion. When the Buddha talks about wherever you go, whatever you do, you will encounter suffering, he said. And of course that's absolutely true, but that statement taken in isolation sounds very negative. But only if you take it in isolation. The Buddhist teaching is to show you the possibility of transcendence. So it's only when you have not encountered transcendence in your life, then whatever situation you go into, whatever you achieve, either through hard work or through your techniques of manifestation or combination of hard work and techniques of manifestation, yes, you might achieve things, but you will encounter again suffering. So when you hear the Buddha's teaching on suffering, it sounds initially as if it were a negative teaching, and some academics who study Buddhism will tell you that Buddhism is a life-denying religion, which is complete nonsense. It is, but transcendence is relatively meaningless when you have not experienced it in yourself. You can't even see what he's talking about. When the Buddha talks about, what is the Buddha's word for kingdom of heaven, for that spaciousness? What does he say? He says, sunyata, which is translated as emptiness. Oh, well, that is the least inspiring teaching any great teacher has given. What's at the bottom of it all? What is the secret of life? They ask him. And he says, emptiness. What? How can you strive for emptiness? What's the point? Jesus is a little bit more inspiring because he says kingdom of heaven. But that can be very misleading, because then you start looking up. That's misleading. Heaven is potentially a good term because it means spaciousness. The same thing as the Buddha said emptiness is spaciousness. That would be my translation of sunyata, that term, is spaciousness, formless consciousness, unconditioned consciousness, beingness itself. That's the essence, and that's the realization. So, they're all pointing to it's exactly the same thing, or the same no thing. So, yes, of course, you encounter suffering, as the Buddha says, no matter what you do and where you go. Sooner or later, and usually sooner, it makes you suffer again. And you're back in anxiety and not enough and continuous conflict with other people. And you're making yourself and others unhappy. And so it's amazing to see that the teachings are all the same, but you only realize that when you experientially realize what it is that they're talking about. Let's read something, a little line from, I've never done this before, reading out aloud something from the Bible during a talk. This is a wonderful thing here. He's talking about things and giving importance to things. But I would say things include anything that you identify with. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. thieves break in and steal, and moths consume. Of course, the moth consumes clothes and so on. They eat it up, and rust consumes anything material is subject to decay. Anything, and this teaching is the equivalent to Buddha's teaching on impermanence. All phenomena are impermanent. Anything that arises in your life is impermanent. You can have any achievement or any possession or anything, it is impermanent. So do not attach yourself to it, because if you attach yourself to it, which means use it in the service of your ego identity, then because it is impermanent, it is subject to decay, moth and rust, a wonderful image, then you suffer. So what is, Jesus says instead, realize, now the words I use, realize what is of primary importance. Then, once you realize is not something that you realize now and then it's gone. When I say realize, it needs to be in the background of your life continuously. That is the realization of the transcendent dimension. When you're able to step out of thinking frequently and experience these little spaces of aware presence, that's the beginning of it, and acknowledge the moments when you're not thinking. Acknowledge when you're just looking at something, and there's an underlying sense of beingness or presence. And so there's less of you as a person and more of you as unconditioned consciousness. And so gradually the person diminishes, the unconditioned consciousness grows, so to speak. The person begins to recede. It'll always be there a little bit, because that's just your form identity. As long as you're here in the body, there's a form, you have a form identity, and you're increasingly, the essence identity shines through, and there's then you connect with the power, a huge power that frees you from the pseudo ego power. The ego looks for power to control, power over others. But this is a totally different kind of power that you connect with, that you realize you are part of, and that's the power of presence, the power of consciousness itself, the power of life itself. And you can't think about that. It's not arrived at through thinking. It is not arrived at through any doing. Any spiritual practice, meditation is wonderful, but as long as you regard it as a doing, it is only of limited usefulness. But when suddenly you realize that the essence of meditation is not trying to get anywhere, it's trying to be where you are already, to experience the being of here and now, then you're no longer doing a meditation. Meditation is true meditation is the realization of being, it's not a doing, so you cannot do a meditation. So you realize the underlying I am, and you don't add anything to it, not this or that anymore. I am. Beingness itself. To be is the infinitive. I am strangely enough, is the first person singular of the same. They sound totally different. It's how that came about, I don't know. With most words, you have the infinitive, to love, and then you say first person singular is I love. Okay. But here we have to be, and you don't say I be, you say I am. How that came about, I don't know. The be still survives in the German language, because I am in German is ich bin, be, bin, I am. So really in English, it should be I be. I am is beingness. And to realize your beingness is the most freeing and the only truly satisfying thing. And it is important thing again is to realize this isn't something that you need to achieve. It's something that's already here, but it has been overlooked because of the noisy mind and the noisy world that you inhabit, that bombards you with continuous barrage of sense perceptions and things that you need to give attention to, in the same way that you are overwhelmed by your mind with every thought saying, give me more attention, follow me. Plus the intensification or the amplification of that already inherent tendency of you is through technology nowadays. The mind, if the mind wasn't cluttered enough before the advent of text messages and Facebook and Twitter and so on, if it wasn't cluttered enough before then, it's even more cluttered now. There's continuous input of largely meaningless communication, and in many cases negative communication, that is potentially very, very destructive for a human being and very destructive for an entire civilization that could collapse very quickly. Any civilization where the majority of humans lose connectedness with the transcendent dimension cannot survive for very long. Now, we have in our Western society, in many Western countries, the religion has become less and less important. And in many Western countries, Germany, France, Scandinavia, England, the churches are empty. It's become meaningless. Not that religion, as it was practiced before, was necessarily a deeply spiritual thing. It was to a large extent a cultural thing and an ideological thing that served the collective ego. That is true. In that sense, it's maybe a good thing that we're no longer trapped in the ideological kind of religion, which is really an ideology. And yet, in the religion, there was always a little potential opening into the spiritual dimension, because at the very core, deeply hidden of, let's say, Christianity, at the core of it, there is a very powerful and deep spiritual message. It's inherent in the teaching of Jesus and in some of the wisdom of the Old Testament too. It's a mixed bag. Of course, we all know it's a mixed bag. Yes, it's there. It's there in the mythological figure of Jesus. It's there in the crucifixion, which is an image of human suffering. It's there in what the mythological story points to, that Christ You're suffering, you're participating in the suffering of Christ. If you encounter suffering, thereby you're able to surrender to the suffering, thereby the transcendent dimension opens up, at least to some extent in your life. There was always the possibility of, although religions had degenerated into ideologies, there was always the possibility of still encountering the surviving remnants of spirituality that are there. And yet, for many humans, that's gone. And of course, there is an awakening spirituality there, but that's still a small percentage of humans. I don't know what the percentage is in Western countries or in other so-called advanced countries, technologically, Japan and so on. My estimation is that 10% are awakening spiritually, which would be a substantial amount, but still a minority of people who are realizing this, beginning to go through a spiritual transformation, disidentifying from the egoic mind and so on. If it is 10%, that would be still a huge number, and yet that's 90% still don't have it yet. And they don't even have the old religion anymore. So all they're left with is consumption and pleasure seeking and drugs, or work yourself to death to make more money, to buy useless things. That's all an emptiness at the core of Western civilization that's very dangerous. So either we go back to religion, which is very unlikely, to the old-fashioned religion, or those who are still, to whom religion is still meaningful, they can perhaps, they don't need to abandon it, they can perceive the deeper essence, the alive essence that's hiding within their religious tradition. That's a wonderful thing if you're able to do that. Or there's a spiritual awakening outside the religions that is happening. That's the 10% probably that I'm speaking of. It is vital then, you don't need to think about the civilization that you live in. Your main responsibility is your life. Is the spiritual dimension present in your life, which is the transcendent dimension? Now we'll go into it again now, and then we will see whether there's still any need or desirability when the transcendent dimension is there in your life, whether there's still any need or desirability to engage in conscious manifestation, whether would you still want to manifest things by using the mind. So we'll be looking at that, but right here and now, let's become aware of ourselves, or let me use the first person singular, because that's you and that's me. Become aware of the I am. Become aware that you are, and then it becomes the realization of I am. And you may find that it is helpful to be in touch with your body, although you are not your body, not the physical body, and yet there is an inhabiting presence within the body, and I would say that is the underlying intelligence that coordinates the countless extremely complicated functions of the body that are all coordinated. There's an underlying intelligence which is an aspect of the consciousness that you are, and that underlying intelligence is the field that gives it life, that holds the atoms and molecules together. So there's an underlying intelligence that you can sense as a sense of aliveness pervading the entire body. And so when you become present, you become present with your whole body. It's not a head phenomenon. It's an entire body phenomenon. You become present and you can sense that the aliveness that pervades the body. And that's an amazing thing, that there is that vast intelligence. Even now, with all the science, we only understand a fraction of how the body operates. And this underlying field of intelligence underlies the entire universe. It is the underlying intelligence behind the arising of all life forms. And it gradually comes into this dimension more fully. That is the evolutionary process of the universe. The underlying invisible intelligence expresses itself gradually more fully. On the planet, you can see how gradually life, over millions and millions of years, life forms became more complex, more conscious. And the same happening, certainly, all over the universe. So in other words, we're inhabiting an awakening universe. So something in the transcendent dimension, the transcendent realm, is coming into this dimension, and from the point of view of this dimension, it can be seen as an awakening. The universe is awakening. How do I know that? I am awakening. How do you know that? You are awakening. This consciousness is growing. First, there's a dreamlike state of being completely identified with thought. It's like a dream world. And the dream is conditioned by the past, and you go. You aren't even there. There's a fictitious entity that says I, but it's a dreamlike entity, conditioned by the past. And the past goes back, not just personal past, it goes back 1 million years of the whole species and beyond. So there's a conditioned entity, but it inhabits a dreamlike world that's already, it is so conditioned that there's no real freedom there. There's just acting out the conditioning. It's a dream that's determined already. And many humans still live in that dreamlike state. And they might have a PhD, and yet they're still completely identified with their mind. Haven't woken up. And so this awakening is happening. So the universe is waking up out of the dream of form. From the point of view of the wakefulness, it's a dream. When you're in it, it's reality. Depends from what perspective you look at it. So the universe has delighted in creating more and more complex life forms. The universe delights in, obviously, in creating, because just look, for example, at the oceans. The life in the oceans is just unbelievable in its manifold complexity. It's just, even in your wildest imagination, you couldn't think up all those life forms that are in the ocean. Is so miraculous and so incredible. An infinitely creative intelligence is behind all that brings forth an abundance of form. Just unbelievable. And then the life forms on land. And so the universe delights in creating, undoubtedly. So that means you also delight in creating. But the next stage in creating is a different one from the way in which the universe has been creating the past few million years. And we will come to that very soon in our next segment.